There is a strange kind of exhaustion that no one talks about. Not the tiredness that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. This exhaustion lives deeper, in the marrow of people who feel everything, absorb everything, and give everything away. Carl Jung called it the wound of the sensitive soul, the empath who has spent a lifetime being everyone's healer, everyone's mirror, everyone's safe place, and has never once asked, "Who holds me?" Jung wrote something that should stop every empath cold. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, not to accept others, not to understand others, to accept yourself, fully, including the parts you have buried so deep that even you have forgotten they exist. Here is the pain no one names. When you are an empath, you don't just feel other people's emotions, you become them. You shapeshift, you disappear. You pour yourself into the mold of whoever needs you most, and one day you look in the mirror and you cannot recognize the face looking back. You have been so busy feeling everyone else that you stopped feeling yourself. And the shadow, that vast, ignored depth of your own psyche, grows heavier, darker, and more powerful with every year you spend pretending it isn't there. Jung spent his entire life mapping this inner territory. He named the archetypes that live inside us. He described the process of individuation, the long, painful, beautiful journey of becoming whole. And he understood, perhaps better than anyone who has ever lived, that the empath's greatest wound is not that they feel too much. It is that they have never been taught to feel for themselves. In this essay, we are going inside. We are going to look at the 4 great Jungian revelations that every empath needs to hear, about the shadow, the persona, the anima, and the self. We are going to understand why you lose yourself in others, why you attract darkness even when you radiate light, why your sensitivity is not a flaw, but an unintegrated superpower, and what it means to finally, after all this time, stop pretending. Now let's go inside, because what is waiting there will change you. The paradox no one admits. The more you dedicate yourself to helping others, the more dangerous your own shadow becomes. This is the first thing Jung would tell an empath, and it is the hardest to hear, because empaths build their entire identity around goodness, around gentleness, around being the person who never hurts anyone, who always understands, who always forgives. And from that goodness, from that light-filled self-image, the shadow is born, enormous, unacknowledged, and absolutely inevitable. Jung defined the shadow as the sum of everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, every impulse we suppress, every rage we swallow, every need we bury because we fear it makes us selfish or dangerous or unlovable. The shadow is not evil in itself, it is simply unlived life. But when it is ignored long enough, it begins to act on its own, erupting in sudden cruelty, in self-sabotage, in the bitter resentment that poisons the very relationships the empath sacrifices everything to protect. Here is the specific tragedy of the empath's shadow. Because they are so finely attuned to the emotions of others, they become expert at detecting needs, other people's needs. But that same sensitivity is turned completely blind when it points inward. The empath learns, early and deeply, that their own needs are dangerous. Perhaps a parent was overwhelmed. Perhaps love was conditional. Perhaps the message, never spoken aloud but written into the nervous system like code, was, "You are safe only when you are useful." And so the empath buries their anger, their jealousy, their desire for recognition, their hunger to be chosen rather than simply needed. All of it goes into the shadow. Jung wrote with devastating precision, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is not a metaphor. The empath who has never confronted their shadow will keep attracting the same relationships, the same takers, the same emotional vampires, the same people who recognize at some unconscious frequency that this person will give and never demand anything back. Not because the empath is weak, because their shadow is running the selection process from below. Think about the philosophical dimension here. The empath believes they are choosing love. They believe they are consciously selecting who they let into their life. But the shadow has its own agenda. It seeks the experiences it was denied. It craves the confrontations it was never allowed to have. And so the empath, baffled, finds themselves again and again in the same exhausting dynamic. Loving someone who cannot love them back, pouring into a container with no bottom, wondering what is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong with them. Everything is right with them, actually. But only half of them is conscious. The other half, the shadow half, is still a wounded child who never learned that their needs are legitimate, their anger is valid, and their darkness is not something to be ashamed of, but something to be known. Shadow integration for the empath is not about becoming harder. It is not about becoming selfish or cold or tactical. It is about becoming complete. It is about learning to say, I feel rage, and that rage is telling me something true. I feel jealousy, and that jealousy is showing me something I genuinely want. I feel the desire to walk away, and that desire is not abandonment. It is self-preservation. It is the soul announcing, I am here too, I matter too. The shadow, when met with courage and compassion, becomes the empath's greatest source of power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to remain. To stay present without dissolving. To love without disappearing. To give without being emptied. You cannot heal what you refuse to see, and you cannot become whole while only living half your soul. The paradox that breaks empaths, the more beautiful your mask, the heavier it becomes. Jung introduced the concept of the persona, the social face we present to the world. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek theatrical mask, the face an actor wore to play a role. Every human being has a persona. It is necessary. It is how we navigate the complex demands of social life. But the empath does not simply wear a persona. The empath becomes it, so completely, so convincingly, that they can no longer feel the difference between the mask and the face beneath. Why does this happen with such particular intensity for empaths? Because the empath's fundamental architecture is relational. They feel the emotional state of others as if it were their own. They register the smallest shifts in a room, the tightening of a jaw, the flatness in a voice, the micro-expression of disappointment that passes across a face in under a second. And from this exquisite sensitivity, they learn to adapt, to become whoever is needed, to smooth the discomfort before it becomes conflict, to be the peacemaker, the caretaker, the endlessly patient listener. This is not manipulation. This is survival. For many empaths, this shape-shifting began in childhood, in homes where emotional unpredictability was the weather they had to navigate daily. Reading the room was not a skill, it was a necessity, and so they became extraordinarily good at it. They became masters of the persona, shapeshifters of the highest order, people whose warmth and attentiveness feel like a gift to everyone around them. But here is the price. Jung was unambiguous about what happens when a person identifies completely with their persona. The persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others and, on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. The concealment, once begun, becomes automatic. The empath learns so thoroughly to read and meet the needs of others that they lose contact with the foundational question of their own existence. What do I actually feel? What do I actually want? This is the philosophical depth that makes this tragedy so painful. The empath often becomes genuinely extraordinary at their role. They are the beloved friend, the devoted partner, the irreplaceable colleague. The persona works beautifully. It generates love, admiration, and belonging, which is exactly what the empath has been seeking. But the love they receive is not love for them. It is love for the performance. And somewhere in their body, in that quiet chamber where the true self still waits, the empath knows this. They feel it as a specific, nameless loneliness. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who need you and seen by no one who truly knows you. There is another dimension to this that Jung saw with particular clarity. The persona, when it swallows the individual, generates a profound unconscious resentment. Because the empath, beneath their beauty and their patience and their endless availability, is also exhausted. They are also hungry. They also want to be chosen in their mess, known in their difficulty, loved without having to perform. And when that hunger is never met, because the mask is too convincing, because no one can see through it to ask, the resentment accumulates like sediment. It does not explode, not in an empath. It seeps. It manifests as the slow withdrawal of genuine feeling, the mechanical performance of warmth that no longer comes from the heart, the subtle and terrifying numbness that sets in when a soul has spent too long pretending. The invitation here is not to destroy the persona. That would be psychologically catastrophic and socially impossible. The invitation is to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold both the social face and the private self simultaneously without collapsing one into the other. To be able to say, even if only to yourself in the stillness before sleep, this is the face I showed the world today, and this is what I actually felt. That gap, the space between the mask and the face, is where the journey toward wholeness begins. To know the difference between who you are playing and who you actually are, that is not a small thing. For an empath, it is everything. The mask that protects you from being hurt also prevents you from ever being truly known. The paradox that haunts sensitive souls: you are drawn to pain you have not yet healed in yourself. Jung identified one of the most profound archetypal patterns in all of human psychology, the wounded healer. In Greek mythology, this archetype was embodied by Chiron, the centaur who was struck by a poisoned arrow, who could not heal himself, but who became the greatest teacher and healer of heroes precisely because of his wound. The wound itself was the source of the wisdom. The pain itself was the portal. Empaths carry this archetype with an intensity that can be both their greatest gift and their most recurring wound. Because the empath is, almost universally, someone who has known suffering, who learned to feel deeply because feeling deeply was how they survived an environment that was unpredictable or demanding or emotionally complex. Their sensitivity was not a choice. It was an adaptation. A brilliant, costly, ingenious adaptation that allowed them to read the emotional landscape around them and find safety within it. And then they carry that sensitivity into adulthood, and here the pattern becomes visible. The empath finds themselves drawn again and again to people who are broken in familiar ways. The partner who cannot commit, who mirrors their own childhood experience of love being withheld. The friend who is always in crisis, who activates the empath's deep need to be needed, to be useful, to earn their place. The colleague who is brilliant but volatile, whose unpredictability the empath somehow feels equipped to manage because they have been managing emotional volatility since they were small enough to be carried. This is not pathology. This is the psyche seeking completion. Jung understood that the unconscious moves toward healing, but it moves through repetition before it moves through resolution. We return to the wound not because we are damaged, but because something in us knows the wound has not yet been understood. The empath keeps choosing the person who cannot give them what they need because some part of them is still trying to resolve the original question. Am I worthy of love when I have nothing left to give? Jung wrote in one of the most psychologically sharp observations of the 20th century, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." This transformation is what the empath unconsciously seeks in every relationship. They want to be transformed. They want contact that reaches all the way through the mask and touches the real self. But because they have not yet learned to ask for that contact directly, because vulnerability of that magnitude feels too dangerous, they seek it obliquely, through the act of healing another. Here is the philosophical dimension that changes everything. The empath cannot truly heal another person. This is not cynicism. This is deep Jungian truth. Each person must do their own work. The shadow must be met in the basement of one's own psyche, not in someone else's living room. What the empath can do, what they uniquely, brilliantly, extraordinarily can do, is provide the relational field in which another person feels safe enough to begin their own process. They can be the presence that makes healing possible. But they cannot be the healing itself. And the moment the empath confuses these two things, the moment they believe their love, their patience, their selfless devotion can transform someone who is not yet ready to transform themselves, they have entered a cycle that will exhaust them and change nothing. Because they have displaced their own healing onto another person's journey. They are pouring energy outward that belongs inward. They are using the role of healer to avoid the terror of becoming the patient. The integration of the wounded healer archetype asks a devastating question of every empath. What would you do with yourself if no one needed healing? If there were no crisis to manage, no wound to tend, no darkness to hold, who would you be? What would you want? This question, met honestly, is the beginning of the real work. Not the work of healing others. The work of healing yourself with the same ferocious tenderness you have given to everyone else. You cannot lead someone through a darkness you have never agreed to walk through yourself. The paradox that opens into freedom. The only way to stop losing yourself in others is to fully, fiercely become yourself. Jung's concept of individuation is one of the most demanding, most beautiful ideas in all of depth psychology. It is not about becoming independent. It is not about becoming hard or closed or self-sufficient in the cold sense of that word. Individuation is about becoming a complete, differentiated person. Someone who has met their own shadow, dismantled the false persona, integrated the masculine and feminine energies within themselves, and made contact with what Jung called the self, the organizing center of the entire psyche, the deepest layer of who you actually are beneath all the roles and adaptations and survival strategies. For the empath, individuation is both more urgent and more difficult than for most. More urgent because the empath, without this process, is perpetually at risk of what Jung called psychic inflation through identification with others, a state in which the boundaries between self and other become so thin that the empath literally cannot distinguish their own emotional experience from that of the people around them. They may believe they are depressed, only to realize they have been absorbing the depression of someone they love. They may believe they are angry, only to recognize it as the rage of a collective they have been unknowingly holding. Without the strong, differentiated center that individuation builds, the empath is a vessel with no walls, capable of holding everything, capable of holding nothing. And individuation is more difficult for the empath because every instinct they have been trained toward pulls them away from it. Individuation requires solitude, and the empath is terrified of abandonment. Individuation requires confronting the shadow, and the empath has built their entire identity around being kind. Individuation requires saying no, and the empath was taught at the most foundational level that saying no breaks the bond. Jung described the self, the destination of individuation, with a symbol he found across cultures and mythologies, the mandala, the circle of wholeness. The self is not the ego. The ego is the conscious mind, the small executive self that plans and decides and manages daily life. The self is something infinitely larger, the total personality, including everything the ego has rejected, every unlived possibility, every suppressed gift. When the empath makes contact with the self, something profound shifts. They no longer need to seek wholeness in another person. They no longer need to merge with someone else's pain to feel real. They carry their own center, their own gravity, their own orientation. This does not mean they feel less. The individuation of an empath does not produce a person who has lost their sensitivity. It produces something far more powerful, a person who feels with great depth and remains stable, who can enter another's darkness and return to themselves, who can love with extraordinary openness and maintain the boundary between self and other that makes genuine relationship possible. The tragedy of the unindividuated empath is not that they love too much. It is that they love without a self to love from. And that kind of love, however sincere, cannot sustain itself or truly help the one it is offered to. Jung wrote something that serves as a North Star for this entire process. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who your parents needed you to be. Not who your partner needs you to be. Not who your wound shaped you to be. Who you truly are, including your darkness, your desire, your power, your rage, your grief, your luminous, specific, irreplaceable selfhood. The philosophical truth that underlies all of this is that the empath's sensitivity, properly integrated, is not a curse. It is a form of consciousness that the world desperately needs. The person who can feel the room, who can sense what is unspoken, who can hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately, who can sit with another's pain without flinching. This person has a rare and precious gift. But that gift can only be offered sustainably, cleanly, and genuinely from a self that is intact, from a self that has done the work, from a self that knows where it ends and another begins. Individuation is not a destination. It is a process, a daily practice, an ongoing conversation between the conscious mind and the vast unconscious depths. For the empath, it begins with a single, revolutionary act, turning the same depth of attention they have always given to others, inward. Asking themselves the questions they have always asked on behalf of everyone else. What do I feel? What do I need? What is true for me? Not for the relationship, not for the harmony of the room, but for me, right now, in this body, in this moment. This is not selfishness. This is the foundation of every genuine act of love, because you cannot give from emptiness. You cannot hold another's pain when you are drowning in your own. You cannot see another person clearly when you cannot see yourself. The empath who has done the inner work, who has met their shadow with courage, shed the consuming persona, recognized the wounded healer in themselves, and begun the long walk toward the self. This empath becomes something the world rarely sees. A person who is both fully open and fully grounded, fully present and fully themselves. That is not an ending. That is a beginning. You were never meant to be the answer to someone else's story. You were always meant to be the author of your own. Before the last words, there is a moment I want to ask you to stay in. Don't rush it. Don't explain it away. Just stay with what has moved inside you during this conversation, because something has, even if you cannot name it yet. Jung believed that the psyche moves toward healing the way a plant moves toward light. Not because it is commanded to, not because it has been convinced by argument, but because wholeness is the fundamental direction of the living soul. You did not come to this video by accident. Something in you already knows the work that is waiting. Something in you has been waiting, perhaps for a very long time, for permission to put down the weight. This is the permission. You are allowed to stop performing your goodness. You are allowed to feel the anger you have been swallowing for years and recognize it as information, not destruction. You are allowed to be known in your complexity, not just in your patience and your warmth and your endless availability, but in your need, your fire, your hunger, your darkness. The shadow does not want to destroy you. It wants to be known by you. And the moment you turn toward it with genuine curiosity rather than shame, the moment you say, "I see you and you are part of me," the exhaustion begins to lift. You are not too sensitive for this world. You are not too much. You are not broken in ways that cannot be repaired. You are an empath in the process of individuation, which means you are, by definition, in one of the most courageous and transformative journeys a human being can undertake. The fact that you are here, watching this, listening to this, sitting with these questions, that is not passivity. That is the psyche beginning its own healing. Jung spent his life believing in the possibility of the whole person, not the perfect person. Wholeness has nothing to do with perfection. The whole person is the one who has integrated their contradictions, who can hold their light and their shadow in the same hand, who has stopped trying to be only the parts of themselves that are acceptable and begun to inhabit all of themselves. That person, that whole and trembling and magnificent person, has a kind of power that no amount of performance, no amount of people-pleasing, no amount of empathic self-erasure can ever produce. The empath who stops pretending becomes the most genuinely powerful person in any room they enter. Not because they have become harder, but because they have become real. And in a world of masks, realness is the rarest thing there is. This is your invitation. Not to fix yourself, you are not broken. To know yourself. All of yourself. To carry your shadow with dignity. To let the persona rest when you are alone. To recognize the wounded healer without making the wound your entire identity. To walk the path of individuation with the same fierce love you have always given to everyone else. The journey begins where the pretending ends. If this touched something in you, if it named something you have carried without words, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to go deeper. And in the comments below, tell me, what part of yourself have you been pretending doesn't exist? And what would it mean to finally let it be seen? The space beneath this video is for real answers. This community is for real people. You are safe here. Until next time, keep going inward.